Mr Grimley.
You, Acting President. I rise to contribute to debate on the Public Health and Wellbeing Amendment Bill, which has been the subject of much contention. I have heard that a week is a long time in politics, and we've all been living that motto lately. I'd like to start by acknowledging that whilst the state of emergency does not equate to lockdown measures, it does, however, provide for the opportunity for such measures to be in place. I would also like to place on the record that Darren Hinch's Justice Party notes the need for a state of emergency to exist beyond mid-September. As many have noted, this virus will unfortunately be with us for some time. I stress that point. We need the state of emergency to continue, but the time frame proposed here by the government is a bridge too far. I do briefly want to acknowledge the work of the clerks and the President, who have continually sought to find consensus where possible. And I'm sure that I speak for the entire chamber when I say that none of us are envious of your jobs at the moment, but you have dealt with each issue without fear or favour, and I thank you. To say that our lives have changed forever due to this virus would be a massive understatement. The way Victorians work, interact, exercise and socialise has dramatically changed. On my way into Parliament yesterday, it just hit me how silent the city is. Shop fronts vacant, trams empty and laneways deserted. Indeed, COVID-19 has changed the way that Parliament functions. This has been a positive for those that have been able to find digital solutions working remotely. Equally, there has also been some concerning trends which have arisen out of COVID-19. The sidelining of Parliament, the government's inability to adequately consult with non-government members, the politicisation of our top health officials, the lack of consistent, reliable and researched information from the government in particular to members of the crossbench, and the list goes on. In speaking to this legislation, it is also important to understand the way in which the crossbench was engaged for support on the legislation. A courtesy call was made to crossbench MPs minutes before the Premier made his announcement that he was introducing this bill. On the same day, crossbench MPs and staff were offered a briefing in which public servants and advisors attempted to answer questions. That was pretty much it. We were then left to sell complex legislation to an understandably anxious public. No roadmap for a way out of stage 4 restrictions was provided. No modelling to suggest that restrictions could be eased in some rural communities without a single positive COVID case. That was simply it. In seeking clarification of the state of disaster powers with various members of the government in relation to the edge of the cliff scenario, which I think Minister Mikakos referred to earlier as we would literally be off the edge of a cliff, which I don't think we'll be literally off the edge of the cliff. But anyway, I was verbally advised that such advice was principally privileged from the Solicitor General's office and was unable to be supplied to myself in writing. Here we have to go on the word of the government that a state of disaster has a higher threshold for restrictions to be put in place for a little while, and that is one of the few reasons why a state of emergency is the preferred option. Such details without substance made it near on impossible for us as minor parties with limited staff and minimal access to lawyers in order for us to make informed decisions on such important pieces of legislation in such a short time frame. It is incumbent on the government, I would have thought, to ensure that every member of Parliament was afforded full and complete disclosure of information surrounding legislation for us to make these decisions. If we as MPs cannot get this significant information, then what hope have the mums and dads and everyone else for that matter at home got? We don't have the luxury of lawyers at our fingertips. We rely on the hard work of the EO staff and our own research into legislation to review and analyse at times extremely complex and complicated information. Every time I asked a member of the government for information, it was provided verbally only and in scarce detail. How can we make important decisions based on this? Well, the only way we can is to listen. And listen we did. We listened to the hundreds of phone calls to our office in the past week. We have read, and are still replying to, mind you, to over 5,000, which I should probably correct that now, it's nearly 6,000 emails we have received in the past week. The majority of which I found weren't the usual robo emails that we were used to, but instead individually typed at length from people willing to put their names and addresses and contact details to and overwhelmingly in opposition to this legislation. I have seen nothing like it. not to mention the reaction and comments on social media. And I take up the point, and I was listening with interest to Mr. Meddick's contribution earlier on, and how that the majority of emails he had received have been from the robo email system, the general form. And I was sitting in my office and I thought, I found that different. So I went back, randomly selected from about a week ago, the 24th of August, 100 emails, and I just went through and previewed them, and I found that 70% were from were individually, and 30% were from the robo generic thing. That's just my emails. And today, I just went through the last 50 that I've received, and all of them have been individual. It has been an avalanche of frustrated, angry and desperate people, all wanting a sense of hope and optimism. One of the emails I received was from a 12-year-old, young Bella, and she may be watching right now. She had a question. She was asking why it was okay for those with boyfriends and girlfriends to get together, but it was not okay for grandparents to see their grandchildren. She wrote about her grandmother, who lives alone, and wasn't allowed to see her, and this made her miss her. She writes that Granny is 81 years old, she lives by herself, and she is lonely. Bella was questioning why we don't pass laws like in New Zealand, where people living alone are allowed to have one family to interact and visit. Well, Bella, I wish you and your granny well during these tough times, and I understand that the Chief Health Officer over the weekend has signalled some possible easing of restrictions in this space, and I'll be ever hopeful of some safe and socially responsible ways that you can see your granny soon. Therein lies the big issue here. Families are struggling, people are lonely, and they just want some sense of hope. This bill is not complemented by additional support measures for those needing additional mental health support or enduring family violence. Suicide rates continue to rise, and it is our young people and those in regional centres in particular who are suffering the most. Geelong has a disproportionate rate of suicide with young people. This is not acceptable, and despite the great work of local mental health organisations, certainly in Western Victoria, there is still a lot more needing to be done. I was not elected to Parliament because of my views on state of emergency. However, I was elected to represent my party and the constituents of Western Victoria, and these powers should not be used lightly. Melbourne is the subject of some of the strongest lockdown measures in the world. They are working, and of course, no life can be measured in dollars and cents. However, debate on this bill should be mature enough to note that the total cost of Victoria's lockdown this quarter is estimated to be as high as $12 billion. Money pulled from our economy, which is a future source of funding for schools, hospitals and social services. Now, on the legislation before us, I must admit that its smallish length is somewhat misleading. What appears to be a physically small bill has ended up to be the source of much conversation and debate over the past week. As stated before, Darren Hench's Justice Party notes the need for a state of emergency to exist beyond mid-September. The initial bill to legislate a state of emergency to exist for an initial 12 months. 18 months in which one government can declare a state of emergency is a worrying thought. These are monumental powers in which the government wants to exercise without the checks and balances. The amended legislation tries to find some middle ground by giving the government the ability to declare a state of emergency for an additional 6 months. However, I think these amendments still miss the point. As mentioned before, some members of the public simply don't understand the difference between a state of emergency and lockdown measures. This needs to be addressed by the government. Clearly, the communication from the government to the community is seriously lacking. How else could you explain the level of anxiety we are currently seeing among hard-working and stoic Victorians? Additionally, the government has been unable to provide written advice to me from the Solicitor General or the Attorney General for that matter about whether or not a state of disaster can only exist in conjunction with a state of emergency. And I must say that I am thankful for the Attorney General and also Minister Symes and also Minister Makakos for their advice over the phone in recent times. I am very thankful for that advice. It is my belief also that even with the passage of this bill, the state of emergency would still have to be declared by the government in 4-week blocks, as it is now. But I stand to be corrected. Whilst ministers are aided by a large party organisation, electoral staff, ministerial staff and government departments, crossbenchers like myself and Ms Maxwell and I have assess each piece of legislation with very limited staff and resourcing. My staff do a brilliant job, but there are times where minor parties simply have to take the word of our public servants, and therefore the independence of these public servants is vitally important. The government argues that this bill simply lengthens the total period for which a state of emergency declaration may continue and clarifies the power of the Chief Health Officer in respect of directions. If only. Some of the additional powers which are included within this bill are the ability to restrict movement, the ability to search premises without a warrant, the ability to enforce mandatory quarantining for those who have tested positive to COVID-19, the ability to enforce mandatory face masks, and the ability to detain any person for a period reasonably necessary to eliminate or reduce a risk to public health. The government has known for some time that they only had 6 months to exercise such extraordinary powers. They had time to properly consult the crossbench and draft COVID-specific legislation which finds consensus between public opinion and health advice. Having left it this late, they are now entirely dependent on the passage of this legislation. In our discussions with the government, Ms Maxwell and I have espoused the opportunities for regional areas to be exempt with restrictions, in particular those areas that have had a zero COVID-19 case for some time. In Western Victoria, the council areas of Glenelg, West Wimmera and the Grampians, just to name a few. The feedback from these communities has been overwhelming, with desperate pleas to end, or at the very least ease, restrictions. To those in regional areas, rest assured that we are listening and continually advocating on your behalf wherever and whenever we can. Darren Hinch's Justice Party supports you. In wrapping up, I'd like to thank the incredible work of all our frontline workers and all they have been doing during these times, the health workers and the emergency service workers. And I thank Danny Hill and Wayne Gatt for their advocacy on behalf of their respective associations. It has been very interesting to note that while the organisations have recently called for a 6-month extension, my discussion with former colleagues suggests a smaller time frame, and indeed some of the medical fraternity that I've spoken to suggest alternatives also. I would also like to conclude by stating that while Darren Hinch's Justice Party will not be supporting this bill, Ms Maxwell and I look forward to working with members of the government to ensure that our lives return back to normal as soon as it is safe to do so. The health and safety of all Victorians is of the utmost importance. Regardless of what happens with this bill, I truly believe that the best days are still ahead of us. Thank you.